Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to our presentation, The Constitutional Convention, June to September 1787. This presentation is part of a series about the creation of the U.S. Constitution, and our speaker for tonight, Dr. Jim Gibb, will be presenting on the Constitutional Convention in 1787, including how we know about secret discussions held between the Founding Fathers, the divide between delegates from small states and large states, and how all of that and more shaped the creation of the Constitution. So my name is Allison. I work for the St. Mary's County Library System, and I'm going to be facilitating tonight's presentation. So tonight's speaker, as I mentioned, is Dr. Jim Gibb. Jim, would you be able to talk a little bit, very briefly, about your background?
Okay, well, my name is Jim Gibb. I hold a variety of degrees in anthropology from the State University of New York system. I've been an archaeologist. Come next March, it will be 50 years. So I've been doing this for a little while. And I more or less run the Smithsonian Environmental Archaeology Laboratory, which is at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which takes on volunteers of all sorts. So come join us.
Thank you.
There we go. As is becoming my habit with these talks, I start off with a quotation that's pertinent. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. So this gives us a little bit of a peek into the Constitution. It's about controlling government. So originally, this was going to be part four of a six-part series. It's still part four, but now it's part four of a nine-part series. Sorry, there's a lot to cover with the Constitution. So we'll be going well into next year. So I won't bother you. Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I always write a title and an abstract for a talk I give, whether or not we actually use them. But this is kind of important. There's a major issue in the Constitutional Convention between small states, that is, states with relatively small populations, and large states, which have large populations. And with the latter, I speak specifically of Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. And I'll talk a little bit about them. I'll show you some numbers to give an idea of what we're talking about. There's also a north-south divide because slavery was most common south of Pennsylvania. There was slavery throughout the colonies, but the economies of the southern states were required. They depended on slavery. So we're going to talk about these things. We're going to talk about, well, who exactly are we the people that we see in the preamble to the Constitution? Uh, and we see what we'll see is this constant attempt to create a balance between representing us, the people, and representing the states, the individual states. And that's going to figure prominently in how the Constitution structures our government. So let's just move on. Just an image, from the Constitutional Convention. George Washington was the president of the Constitutional Convention. He was the natural choice, and that's him in the middle. Anyway, so we've got some questions. Is the United States Constitution democratic? Do we have a true democracy? Or are there non-democratic elements in the way our government is structured? To give away the answer to that is, yeah, there are non-democratic aspects to our system. Who ratified the United States Constitution? Was it the people or was it the states? And that issue continued well into the 19th century. It maybe shows up nowadays. Who actually ratified the Constitution? Whose Constitution is it? The British Constitution, a lot of you may know, doesn't exist as a single piece of paper. It's the Magna Carta, it's various sorts of other documents, it's legal precedent, it's all sorts of things. There's nothing you can point to in the UK and say, there it is, that's their constitution. Ours is very different. And then some other questions. Political parties, where do they come in? There is no mention in the Constitution about political parties, nor non-governmental organizations, think tanks, League of Women Voters, the Rock the Vote project every 4 years, American Civil Liberties Union, Southern Poverty Law Center. I mean, none of these things are in the Constitution. So we might ask, well, where do they come from? And how do they fit into all this? Let's start with how do we know about the U.S. Constitutional Convention? When these folks met in the end of May of 1787 in Philadelphia, they spent the first couple of days kind of laying out what the rules of the convention would be. One of them was that it would be kept secret. Nobody outside the convention delegates would be allowed in. No newspaper, no press releases, none of that. It was all in secret. So how is it we know anything about it? And so I'll be talking about some of the sources. Um, One of them, and this you can find online. I even have a link there, although you probably don't want to try to write it down right now. But I had to get some of this stuff out of the way. Oops. There we go. Federal Convention of 1787, edited by Max Farrand. This is from early 20th century. It's 3 volumes, but you could download it from the Library of Congress. So these are the actual notes, the formal notes of the convention. Uh, and they're what you'd expect, who made what motion, etc. They provide some insight, but by themselves, you can't actually figure out what was going on. For that, we use some other sources. And the most valuable are the notes of debates in the Federal Convention of 1787. These are James Madison's personal notes. He was an assiduous note taker, covering what each of the delegates would say, or at least summarizing it, and sometimes, many instances, quoting what the other delegates were saying, including himself. In fact, he always talks about himself in the third person. So if he's saying something, he'll say, James Madison said. His notes were published, uh, 1820s, 1830s. Most of this material came out in the late 20s and early 1830s. So they really sat on this stuff for some time. Another source are the notes of what we might call at this point the anti-federalist, Robert Yates from New York. His notes are pretty good, but he left the convention halfway through. So they're not nearly as complete as those of James Madison. And
Hey,
also published, yes?
oh, we have a question in the chat.
Mhm.
Um, Janet says, I have been getting emails about the threat of an Article 5 convention and the fact that it should be stopped. What are the implications of an Article 5 convention? Thanks.
I'm not going to cover that until the seventh lecture, I think, but actually I hadn't heard anything about it, to be honest. The to keep it brief, the Constitution is divided into 7 articles. Article 1 is executive, or Article 2, I'm sorry, Article 1 deals with the legislature, 2 with the executive, 3 with the judiciary. Articles 4 through 7 really have to do with the states and the relationship of the states to the federal government. So before I talk about that and answer your question in a few months, I'll look into this. I hadn't heard anything about it. Um, Also, usually published with Robert Yates notes are those sort of an address by Luther Martin, who is the Attorney General for Maryland and represented Maryland at the convention as a delegate. His reporting is not considered reliable. He's just so extreme, so partisan, if you will, that it's hard to make very good use of what he had to say. Yates was a little more balanced in his approach, but again, he left the convention early. Another source, which is after the convention, but it gives you a pretty good idea of at least what some of these folks thought the discussions were about and what solutions they had arrived at. The Federalist Papers, uh, mostly are the work of Alexander Hamilton, some by James Madison. I think there are three articles by John Jay. This is a series of newspaper opinion pieces published in New York State, designed to sway the vote for New York to ratify the Constitution. New York was in a critical position, essentially dividing the New England states from the southern states. It would have been very difficult to have a cohesive nation if New York was not part of it. So I think that 83 is the number that sticks in my head, 83 different pieces. It's rather lengthy, and it's written in late 18th century prose, so it could be a little difficult to work your way through, but it is very informative. The U.S. Supreme Court and attorneys uh, uh, having cases before the Supreme Court often refer to the Federalist Papers, specific papers. The other set of papers are the Anti-Federalist Papers by Patrick Henry, Robert Yates of New York, and others. And these are folks who are saying why the Constitution, as framed, uh, was not in the best interest of the country. And these are guys who really wanted the focus to be on states and wanted to continue this kind of loose federation among states, more of a treaty type thing, rather than a national government. Another source, what I recommend, it's a very good book, is American Constitution, a biography. And it's by Akhil Ahmad. It's lengthy, but to my money, it's a real page turner. Um, it goes through the Constitution systematically, goes into a lot of depth, but does so in a very engaging way. Another book by Robert Dahl, published back in early 2000s, How Democratic is the American Constitution? It's an interesting book, but it has a major flaw to it. He's part of a group of conservative thinkers who are talking about legislation from the bench, talking about how the courts were making laws. And I've given it a lot of thought. I've given it a lot of reading. I think that's just PR type stuff. It's nonsense. The courts do not write legislation. They determine whether or not a law is constitutional. And if government is not complying with its own laws, it will tell the government it's not complying with its own laws and needs to do so. But it doesn't. Judges don't legislate from the bench. The undemocratic aspects, which I wanted to point out because they're reasonable, toleration of slavery. There's nothing democratic about that, at least not for the slaves. Discrimination and suffrage. Women didn't have the right to vote. A lot of men didn't have the right to vote. The Electoral College gives undue weight to states with very small populations. They basically have more influence on who's elected the president of the United States than folks who live in the larger states. Uh, Senators were originally selected by the legislatures, and I'll talk a little bit about this in, I think, lecture 5 or 6. Um, 6. Because it's not until 1913 that we voted for our senators. Until then, it was our state legislatures who selected senators. We have two senators for each state, no matter how big no matter how large the population of that state. And then judicial determination of constitutionality. His Dahl's view is that the people decide what's constitutional, what's right, what's wrong, not the courts. And that, to me, is open to debate. Okay. So in terms of, I don't want to go into this too deeply, but in terms of representation, we have here a population map of the United States. You'll notice left of center is Wyoming, um, with a population of around 600,000. And then you have California. I'm sure you all know where that is, a population of 20 million. There's about the average constituency of a congressman in California is 770,000, whereas the average constituency in Wyoming is much smaller. And what that means is a voter in Wyoming their vote essentially is worth more than that of a voter in California, simply because, relatively speaking, they have greater representation in the House of Representatives. All the states, of course, have two senators. So, anyway, got that out of the way. Let's talk about the Constitutional Convention and start off with, well, where did it happen? Now, what's going on? So, in this map, which is redrawn from 1790, but it gives you a sense of how what is now the United States was divided up. The states were really on the eastern seaboard, but you can see, for instance, Lake Superior towards the middle, you've got Massachusetts spanning that, Connecticut just below it, Virginia, all these extending to the Mississippi River, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. These states were claiming land out to the Mississippi River, which became a little bit of a problem that was eventually rectified by them surrendering those their presumed rights to that land. But in this little rectangle I have here with red and yellow, that's Philadelphia. So that's where Philadelphia stands relative to the other colonies. Not quite midway, but more or less. And in terms of population, probably if you did a population map, it would probably be the center of the population at the time. Philadelphia in 1796, as I talked about, I think, well, probably in the first series on the Declaration of Independence, Philadelphia and the other major cities were really quite cosmopolitan. So here we have in a grid fashion, the city proper divided up into blocks with broad avenues, named streets, and all that. This is would you wouldn't find a competitor in Europe. This is essentially a European city in terms of its cosmopolitan setup, its culture, society. And in Philadelphia, this is an early map by about 20 years, but you can see north points to the right-hand side of the page, as was pretty common up through the 18th century. But you can see those two blocks represent Carpenter's Hall, which is where the First Continental Congress met, and um, Independence Hall in yellow. So they're more or less centrally located in downtown, what was then downtown Philadelphia, the well-developed portion of the town. A view of it, again, this is a cosmopolitan city for that period. So it was not only centrally located, but it was very sophisticated. It had resources. It had taverns in which delegates could stay for lengthy periods of time for room and board. And of course, lots of places to drink. At the time, population is a little hard to get. There weren't formal censuses, but around 30,000 people, which is about the size of Annapolis today. Philadelphia has a reputation for hot, humid summers, just like we do in Maryland. So meeting there in the summer, maybe not the best of ideas. In terms of sanitation, we have a quote here: "A stench often hung over the city during the dog days of July and August." This is a city, I mean, you've got human sanitation, you've got horses fertilizing the streets and dogs and trash. And, with that heat and humidity, it could be unpleasant during the summer. That's important because our conventioneers, 55 of them, uh, were locked up in on the first floor of Independence Hall and subject to those smells, the heat, the humidity, even the noise on the streets. These are cobblestone streets. And the conventioners, got the city to lay down gravel on top of the cobblestones in front of Independence Hall just to sort of muffle the sound of the wagons and horses. So not an ideal place to meet. Uh, Independence Hall itself, this is from uh, the Historic American uh, Engineering Record and HABS, the Historic American Building Survey. Nice drawings, measured drawings of the building. It's set up to conform to what you see in the photograph there. These are actually fairly small buildings. Each of these rooms is roughly 30 feet on a side. So they're not huge. You've got a central hall. So it's in these rooms where they're meeting mostly together. There's unlike the during the Revolutionary War, where Congress had committees, and the committees would meet in separate places. During the convention, they met either as a convention, everybody together, or as a committee of the whole, which is still everybody together. And I'll talk a little more about committee of the whole in a moment. So the convention itself convened May 25th, 1787, dissolved September 17th, 1787. So about 116 days, really during the summer. Rhode Island did not send a delegation. And if you recall from the Articles of Confederation discussion, any amendments to the Articles of Confederation had to be unanimous. When Rhode Island refused to show up, that basically put the kibosh on any attempt to amend the Articles of Confederation. George Washington was elected the convention president, and he was the last one to speak. His speech is part of Madison's record. There were 55 delegates representing 12 states. Not all of them showed up on time. New Hampshire was kind of late coming along. Even Massachusetts and I think one or two states was several days into the convention before they had enough delegates to showing up for their state so they could actually vote on issues. 39 of those 55 delegates had served in the Confederation Congress. 7 had been governors, including Edmund Randolph, whom we'll get to in a moment. 8 were signers of the Declaration, and 3 had refused to do so. 15 had some role in drafting their individual state's constitution. John Adams, for instance, was the principal architect of the Massachusetts state constitution. More than 50% were college graduates. A large number actually came from what is now Princeton University, at the time was College of New Jersey.
Hey, Jim,
But yeah,
we have another question in the chat, and it says, did Washington have a preference for either the Federalists or Anti-Federalists?
Washington was a Federalist. Yeah, he was, very definitely. Now, he was diplomatic and he tried to, it's not clear that he spoke very much at all during the convention because his job was to preside over it. So he's essentially a non-voting member. He just sort of, recognizes speakers, etc. So he's really pretty quiet about it. But it's clear from certainly what they eventually produced, his speech at the end, and his subsequent action as president of the United States, that he was definitely a Federalist. 34 of the 55 were trained as lawyers, which explains a lot. But they were also planters, merchants, etc. 19 was slaveholders. Their ages varied from 26 to 81, Franklin being the oldest, of course. What do I have here? And so the average age was around 42 for that, what that's worth. During the first 3 days, the 25th, we got 29 delegates from 9 states, 7 who were actually authorized to vote, probably because those from the 2 other states, not all of their delegates had yet arrived. George Washington was elected unanimously as the convention president, as he was for president. On the 28th, Connecticut and Massachusetts joined. So yeah, they had enough delegates so they can vote. It was during those first few days that the convention determined its rules of procedure. And of course, the most important for us is that they decided that it would be in secret. It would be, no one was allowed in. On Tuesday, the 29th, Governor Edmund Randolph, who at the time was about 35 years old, he was a young guy, He attacked the Articles of Confederation and introduced what we now refer to, or I think they referred to back then, as the Virginia Plan. And this was a series of 15 resolutions that the convention eventually took more or less one at a time in succession. They tabled some and revisited them later. We'll get to that. But once they decided, okay, the Articles of Confederation aren't working, let's look at this plan and go through it step by step. And so what they did was they resolved into a committee of the whole. And what that means, it's a status thing where as a convention, they had certain parliamentary procedures they had to abide by, sort of like Robert's Rules of Order, if you will. As a committee of the whole, they were a committee, and so discussion was much more free-ranging. And the recording of the discussion was much less rigorous. And that's part of the reason why we don't have as good a record as we might have of what was going on. But they resolved in that committee of the whole, and that's where a large part of the discussions occur. At one point in June, the committee of the whole had done their work on the Virginia plan and referred the whole thing to the convention, which of course was them. And at that point, they went through each of the resolutions again. To summarize those 15 resolutions, they're about strong central government. Replacing the articles, they were history. That, as I've discussed before, the Articles of Confederation was really essentially a treaty. At the time, they referred to the Confederation Congress as a federal government. I think that's a misnomer because they really weren't a government. They were a treaty organization. And they contrast a federal government with a national government, which is what they were creating, what we have now. They decided it would be three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. And the idea was each would balance the other. Nowadays, you often hear about the co-equal branches of government. I would argue that three branches of government are not co-equal. First of all, co-equal is kind of a silly, it's like commingle and pre-plan. Putting that prefix on doesn't really help us at all. They're not equal branches. They are independent branches. They're unequal in terms of the size, the scope of their responsibilities. The executive branch is huge. You know, nowadays, a couple million, 3 million people. Judicial branch is much smaller. Legislative branch is much smaller.
And we do have another question in the chat.
Hmm.
So the US was basically like the European Union nowadays. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, actually, I think NATO is probably a better model than the European Union. Frankly, I don't know a lot about the European Union, um, but the European Union does, I think they legislate, and the Confederation Congress did not legislate. It was not a legislative body. So I think NATO is perhaps a better analogy. The resolutions look for a population-based representation, that is democracy. You know, people have a vote. And that ended up becoming a major point of contention, which we'll get to this evening. Uh, the resolutions call for a national executive, that is an executive office, and they weren't sure if that was going to be a president or three people acting together or a president and a council. But they decided it would be a national executive whose the job of which would be to execute the laws passed by Congress. And there would be a national judiciary. And it looks like they really initially misunderstood what that judiciary would be doing. A lot of folks in the convention were afraid that, well, we already have state courts. What do we need a federal judiciary for? And what they weren't really understanding was that the federal government, Congress, would pass its own federal laws that the judiciary would be concerned with. The states would continue to exist and enact and enforce its own laws. It's easy to look at the shortcomings of the conventioneers, 200 odd years after the fact. So I have no special knowledge here other than the experience of the last 230 odd years. Uh, a couple of weeks, no, almost 2 weeks into the convention, uh, William Patterson from New Jersey and John Lansing, I think was from New York, advanced what was called the New Jersey Plan. And this is where the whole large state, small state thing comes into play. Uh, they wanted a unicameral legislature, not a bicameral one, which is what the Virginia plan called for. They wanted the same rules that applied with the Articles of Convention, and that is that each state would have a vote, regardless of population. There would be three branches of government. That much, I think everybody was pretty much agreed on. Increased congressional powers, and specifically, Congress would have to have the power to raise taxes so it would have a revenue, so it could actually do something, and not depend on the states for requisitioned resources. And it would regulate interstate commerce. It was a major problem with the Articles of Confederation, with adjoining states coming up with their own deals and states, threatening to charge impost duties on goods coming in from other states. And by and large, it would protect the rights of states, protect the smaller states from being dominated by the larger states. And again, when I show you some of the numbers, you'll see what they were getting at. So what do we mean by large and small states? Part of the Constitution required that we do a census every 10 years. And the first census would have to be taken within 3 years of Congress sitting, the new Congress sitting under the Constitution. The new Congress, the first Congress, sat in 1789. And so they were required to do a census by 1792. And we refer to it as the 1790 census. And you might think, well, how does this enter the political discourse? I mean, the census, who the hell knows? Who has numbers from the US Census today amongst us? Well, here's an example of how readily available that information was. This is a creamware pitcher made in Staffordshire, England, and it has on it the population census for not only the 13 states, but also the territories that were considered part of the United States, part of the Ohio, uh, and Southwest and Kentucky, which at this point is a state as well. So those numbers are right there on your picture. They were readily available in newspapers. It's hard to make much sense of them on the side of a picture, but I put them in a spreadsheet for you. So I'll take you through these numbers. You don't have to read them all. It's just I want to give you an idea of what they're doing. The first column are free people, largely white European Americans, exclusive of Indians who were not paying taxes. So this is the white population of Connecticut starting off, the number of slaves in Connecticut, and then the number of slaves in Connecticut multiplied by 3/5 or 0.6. They then take that number, that 3/5, add it to the free population to get a total. And then they would divide that number by 34,000 and something. And that's how they would come up with the number of representatives for each state in the new Congress, in the House of Representatives. And it comes, I don't know why they settled on a number of 105, but they divided the total population of the country by 105, and that's how they came up with 34,000 and something. And so that 34,000 and something became the divisor for each state's population to determine a number of representatives. Here's the beef. If you look at those numbers and along the bottom axis here, these are each of the states and territories going from the very smallest, the Southwest Territory, down near Georgia, Florida area, and west of there, and the largest, which was Virginia. And with the largest three states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, 37% of the delegates would be theirs. If you threw in North Carolina, it would come to 49%. If you threw in New York, Maryland, Connecticut, 72%. So a relatively small group of number of states would dominate the House of Representatives. And the smaller states, they might not, no point even showing up. And who should vote? Um, some delegates thought that the state legislatures should elect members of what they then called the first branch, which we now know as the House of Representatives. Roger Sherman from Connecticut was one of those people. George Mason of Virginia responded, "We have seen the mere distinction of color made in the most enlightened period of time, that is, their present, a ground of the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man." This, by the way, is a slaveholder. And what he was saying is that, you know, prejudices come into all of this. Um, but he's referring, what they're dealing with here is there's a question of how do you count slaves? The small southern states, which had large slave populations, in order to not be dominated in the House of Representatives, wanted slaves counted. A few years earlier, in 1783, there was a proposed amendment to the Articles of Confederation, never actually ratified, but it came up with this formula that in calculating the population of any one state to figure out what its contribution, financial contribution would be to the Federation, the Confederation, they would count all the free people and then 3/5 of all other folks. And that eventually appeared in the United States Constitution, Article 1, which has to do with the legislative branch, both in Section 2 and also in Section 9. We'll talk about this next month. The Committee of the Whole rejected the New Jersey plan. They spent a little bit of time on it, but not very much. I think maybe 2 days or a day and a half. It was pretty much rejected outright. And as a result of that, some delegates ended up leaving the convention, if not immediately within the next 4 weeks. And that included the entire New York delegation. Against the New Jersey plan, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, well, the Carolinas and Georgia. There were only three states that were for it: New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. Maryland, as was often the case in American history, was divided, could not decide one way or another. And we talked a little bit about that in the Declaration of Independence series. New Hampshire joined late. They finally got there June 23rd. But because you're essentially 3 weeks late, they had no say in the rules of the convention and missed out on some of the earlier discussion. Rhode Island, as I mentioned before, did not participate at all in the Constitutional Convention and was the very last to ratify the Constitution. Robert Yates and John Lansing of New York both left July 10th. And again, that's where Robert Yates' notes end. But the convention continued to debate the 15 articles. On September 17th, Benjamin Franklin moved to accept the Constitution. Now, this sounds, oh, okay, done. That was easy. This conference had gone on since the end of May in, again, difficult circumstances, a difficult environment. These guys were exhausted. And the end of the 55 delegates who appeared for at least some period of time during the convention, 39 signed. However, those 39 delegates represented all the states except for Rhode Island and New York. Rhode Island not showing up, New York having departed early. So not all of the delegates voted for the Constitution, but each state delegation accepted the Constitution. To be clear, That's not where the Constitution begins. I mean, that's its creation, but it still has to be ratified by at least 9 states. That was one of the rules uh, of the convention. The Constitution had to be ratified by at least 9 states before it would become effective.
And there is a question in the chat that says, any particular reason Rhode Island was against it so much?
Rhode Island did not want to amend the Articles of Confederation, and this convention was set up to amend the Articles of Confederation. I don't know if there was a rumor that we'd be coming up with an entirely new system of government, but they did not want to amend the Articles. And I think it's largely because Rhode Island is the base state. I mean, it's the ocean state or whatever. It's sitting out on the ocean. It's a little state. It derives its wealth through commerce and probably didn't want anybody messing with that, didn't want any constraints placed on its, especially its transatlantic commerce. And so they probably figured they had nothing to gain. In 1791, when they finally ratified the Constitution, everybody else around them had done so, and they probably figured at this point it was a losing cause, that they could not stand up against those United States. They would have to become a part. Uh, Curiously, Edmund Randolph, who introduced the Articles, the Virginia Plan, did not sign. George Mason, major figure behind even getting this convention set up, did not sign. And Elbridge Gerry, who was also very active in the convention, if you read through Madison's notes, he speaks every day and has a lot of good things to say. As a point of pronunciation, too, it is Elbridge Gerry, not Jerry. Um, so we've got the preambles and the articles, and I'm going to be talking about the individual articles with the next 3 lectures. 4. Uh, Article 1 will be one lecture, Article 2 another, Article 3 another, and the last 4 will be compacted together. So, ratification. Um, how is that going to be done? Every state had its choice. It could have a convention, like we have political conventions today, which pretty much anybody can go to, or the state legislatures would ratify. In every instance, the state held a convention. They did not leave it to the state legislatures. The requisite 9 states ratified between December 1787, so yeah, just a few months after the convention ended, and that'd be Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, who curiously, Delaware and New Jersey were the ones who wanted the New Jersey plan. Go figure. And finally, in June 1788, less than a year later, New Hampshire signed on. That made 9. We now have a U.S. Constitution. Virginia came along a few days after that. New York, the following month, hotly contested. That's where we get the Federalist Papers. North Carolina, later that, a little more than a year later. Rhode Island, not till 1790. George Washington became president unanimously of this new nation in what, March of 1789. At the time he was president, there were only 11 states. 2 of them had not yet signed on. North Carolina and Rhode Island were not part of the Union when George Washington became president of the United States. When you look at the numbers, a lot of these were really close. I mean, they look like landslides by today's measure, but ranging between 53% and 55% of the delegates who were elected by the people of each state. They have elected delegates who then voted on whether or not to accept the Constitution. But 53 to 55%, New York had a 57 delegates, 30 voted for, a 3-person margin there. These are pretty close. We came pretty close to not having a U.S. Constitution. Um, I have this quote from James Wilson, who was an eminent jurist after the Revolution, but was also part of the debate over the Declaration and was very much involved in the Constitution. And he says, "You have heard of Sparta, of Athens, and of Rome." This is a period when folks were really into classical civilizations, did a lot of reading. "You have heard of their admired constitutions and of their high-prized freedom. But were their constitutions framed by those who were appointed for that purpose by the people? After they were framed, were they submitted to the consideration of the people? Had the people an opportunity of expressing their sentiments concerning them? Were they to stand or fall by the people's approving or rejecting vote? To all these questions, attentive and impartial history obliges us to answer in the negative. The people were either unfit to be trusted or their lawgivers were too ambitious to trust them. This is in his 4th of July speech of 1788, by which time the Constitution had been ratified by the ninth state. And this is really an important observation. These guys were very learned. They read a lot of history and were looking for models for our government. And as hard as they looked, they could not find a similar instance in history where the people themselves create this Constitution and vote for it, accept it. And that's really what sets apart the U.S. Constitution from all previous constitutions or forms of government.
And we have another question in the chat. It
Mhm.
says, the Virginia Plan did not have a Bill of Rights, so why did Randolph, Gary, and Mason suddenly want a Bill of Rights?
I think it doesn't, I don't recall that appearing in James Madison's notes at all about a Bill of Rights. I may be wrong. I'm rereading them now. Um, that wasn't really the issue at that point. They're really kind of hammering out what this government would look like, what it was allowed to do, and what it wasn't allowed to do. But it was really focused on government, not on the people. And that's what the Bill of Rights supposedly does. It focuses on the rights of individuals. And as we'll get into in a later lecture, I'm not sure that's entirely true either, that the Bill of Rights pertains specifically to our individual freedoms. We'll get to that. But at that point, they're hammering this thing out. That wasn't certainly throughout much of this discussion, the Bill of Rights was not the issue.
Yeah, I don't think that became an issue until the ratification process.
Yeah, well, yeah, at sometime between the end of the convention, that was Ray speaking, by the way, guys. Um, Sometime between the very end of the convention and the beginning of the ratification process, which started pretty quickly, we had 3 states ratifying December. But somewhere in there, and I'm not a historian, certainly not a constitutional historian. That would require a little bit of research. I'm sure historians have a very good answer for that. I don't. But I want to point this out, this new understanding of government. The first paragraph is from the Declaration of Independence. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. So this is their understanding of government, but it's not it's what we don't want. It's not what do we want, and that's what the Constitution's all about. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain, and I draw your attention to that verb, ordain, and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. And using the word ordain, there's almost a religious flavor to this. But here it's say, okay, this is what we're creating. We, the people, are creating this. And then we could throw it out anytime we want. So I want to finish up with some observations. not necessarily answering any of the questions I posed at the beginning. But the convention was held in Philadelphia, summer of 1787, one of the largest, most cosmopolitan of cities, a seaport, which certainly should have made it easier for delegates to get there. They can come by water. And it had really no peer. You know, London was immensely larger, but Philadelphia was just as cosmopolitan, probably a nicer, cleaner place to live as well. And it was near the geographic center of the 13 states. The building it was held in was still relatively new. It was elegant. It was a prestigious place to meet, but it was cramped. And, colonial Philadelphia, well, post-colonial Philadelphia probably smelled pretty bad. That's something if you go down to Williamsburg, Virginia, I don't know if they deal with that at all, but, in these early towns, they might look very elegant, but there's still horse manure all over the streets. There are horses that die in the street. There's, you know, human sewage and stuff. It's quite nasty. The convention extended over about 40 weeks in the summer, uncomfortable time of the year, especially with the shutters closed. Uh, Variable participation by state delegations. It's not like every state had a delegation there on day one and they stayed through the end. It's sort of like a college, university lecture hall, people kind of coming and going. The large state, small state, and slavery divisions. Uh, as well as this whole idea of the federal versus the national government were major points of discussion in the convention. And again, they used federal government. I question the reality of that. I wouldn't call that a government under the Articles of Confederation. I would call it a treaty organization. And at the same time, what we talked about last month was the economic stress and unrest at the time that clearly underlay a lot of the debates. And in the next lecture, too, I have some quotations where these folks in the convention are obliquely referring to Shays' Rebellion and probably other rebellions as well. So that's where I'm going to leave it for tonight. Uh, in January, we'll take up with Article 1, which deals with the United States Congress. Um, there's a lot to cover with that. Half the United States Constitution, omitting all the amendments, including the Bill of Rights. But the main text of the Constitution, half the words in that are devoted to Article 1, which is about Congress. It's about the legislative branch. So it's kind of a big deal. Anyway, if you guys aren't all questioned out, I'll take any other questions you might have.
I
I
forwarded you some stuff about the Article 5 debate I've been seeing.
Okay. I
You can
look
look
forward
at it. Fodder for your lecture 7.
Okay. I mean, you say what you will about our political times today. They certainly create a lot of material for discussion. Um, in a sense, they may rewrite the Constitution, not the written Constitution, but in the British sense, how we use the Constitution. We'll see. For constitutional historians, this is a very interesting time to live in. The rest of us might kind of suck. But there you have it. Okay, I'll look forward to seeing that.
Yes, so the question in the chat says, how influential was the Haitian Revolution to the delegates? Was it similar to Shays' Rebellion in their minds as far as being cautionary?
I don't know the dates of that offhand. Was that in my mind that was immediately after, but no, I don't. I think I haven't seen any reference to it. What you see references to in um, Madison's notes are really oblique references to the sort of uprisings in New England and presumably the Mid-Atlantic states as well. That was fresh in their minds, and Shays' Rebellion was really the big one. That had people talking. That's all the influence. That's all the influence they needed. They didn't need to look abroad. Any other questions?
I was gonna ask, especially like regarding like, I mean, why did we end up like moving like our capital to like DC? Like, why do we even build DC, given that building a city isn't exactly an easy feat, and I mean Philadelphia was already about halfway across the Union,
That,
and
that that's an excellent, good question, and the answer is not that difficult to come by. I guess last month I talked about these uprisings, and one of them was the Philadelphia or Pennsylvania Mutiny. I think I talked about that last month, where while this is before the convention in 1780, jeez, my brain's going. Anyway, before the convention, 1783, a bunch of soldiers in Pennsylvania line uh, came to Philadelphia, locked Congress in, and demanded money. It was a mutiny. It was a riot. And Congress, what they did was they ended up slipping out to Princeton, New Jersey. And then from there, it wasn't particularly well suited for them. They went down to Annapolis, and from Annapolis to New York, and that's where the capital stayed until the District of Columbia was established. The District of Columbia was established in part because Congress, having experienced the mutiny, wanted to be able to protect itself because they asked the state of Pennsylvania to put down the riot, to call out the militia, and they refused to do so. So Congress has its own district with its own National Guard. Also, that way, no state would have the capital, the national capital in it. It would be an independent district. But that's an
uh,
interesting question.
okay, so they basically were trying to like build a new city where they wouldn't really have to deal with what happened in Philadelphia again.
Yeah, that's a big part of the story. So Philadelphia lost the prestige as well as the economic benefits of being the seat of the Congress anyway, permanently. Uh, so just goes to show you unintended consequences.
I seem
Anything
to
else?
remember that that was also part of the discussion about the compromise, in terms of representation as well, wasn't it? That
Uh,
they would move the capital further south.
well, yeah, that was certainly a part of the debates. I'm trying to think. That was actually they hadn't specified a place.
Yeah,
So the District of Columbia, which included part of Maryland, part of Virginia, was selected as a compromise during the Washington's first term, as I recall. And that was part of, sharing state debts nationally and several other things. That was negotiated between Hamilton and Jefferson with Washington. I'm just going from memory. I haven't read that material in some years, but I wasn't part of the actual location of the district. It was established that there would be one, but not where it would be.
All right, so it is 8 o'clock. So we are going to get wrapped up. Thank you once again for being here.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's been good to see you guys. Sorry I didn't have a chance to talk to everybody. Um, looking forward to seeing you next month when my tongue isn't all twisted up.